You're listening to Catholic Family Podcast.
I am back for part 2 of the series with Matt.roch.arthur. We went back into these shows and did a little bit of post-production and a little bit of listening to our own discussion and decided that we missed a few things. First of all, I missed literally introducing Matt.roch.arthur. So anyone who didn't listen to part 1, I first of all highly recommend you go listen to part 1, because part 2 is going to be fairly, I wouldn't say meaningless, but you're going to be kind of set afloat in the middle of a story. So you should definitely start with part 1. But if you're listening to part 2, I do want to introduce Matthew a bit here, exactly who he is, why he's on this show, and what we're going to cover here in part 2. So Matthew, if you want to give a brief description of yourself and what we're doing, that would be awesome here in this second episode.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I will reiterate that listeners should definitely go back and listen to part 1. I will keep this introduction to myself very brief, because if listeners are very interested, they can listen to that one. But to give listeners a quick introduction, I am a husband and father of 2 young daughters. I play piano, guitar, and I try to play violin sometimes, but it doesn't really work out too well. I'm not qualified in music. I love music. I've been writing it for a while. I've done a course on Udemy, which is a website that you can buy courses that if you want to just learn something out of personal interest, but you don't necessarily care about having the piece of paper. So I've done that on music theory. The teacher was a PhD in music and claims that it covers all the material that music students would cover as well, or would learn from. As for the interest in doing this show, I've always loved music. I found that when I found out my wife was pregnant with our first child, I started to think deeply about many things, and music was one of them. And I've come to the conclusion that music needs to be something that we make a decision about. It's not something that we just go, I like the way this sounds, and that's going to be my whole reasoning for listening to this. I think there's something deeper to it. And I've heard people say this in the past. I've heard those who are older and wiser say this in the past, and I've heard clerics say it in the past as well. And I'm trying to come in here with a bit of a nerdy approach and a bit more of a musical approach, as I like to be analytical with some things, including music. So yeah, I haven't heard many shows out there that actually go into a more in-depth analysis of music, of the elements, what's good, what's not good, or maybe what's going to have this effect, whether that's good or not. For instance, some song or piece of music might be totally fine to listen to. However, it might be very sad. And if we as a listener don't understand that this music that we're really enjoying, it's all sad, but I really like it. But why am I always depressed? Why am I always sad? Maybe if we understood, hey, this piece is really nice, but it is also sad. So when we listen to it, let's not binge listen to it or listen to it on repeat 100 times a day. Maybe let's mix it in with other music that's a bit more happy. Just things like that. So it's really one of my motivations to do this show is to really just give listeners the information to help them make the right decisions regarding music.
Perfect. And I know in part 1 we went from the medieval era into the Baroque era, and in part 2 now we're going to talk about the classical era up through the 20th century. In part 3 we'll talk much more in detail about modern music and the effects thereof. Any last words before we get rolling?
I would like to mention something that I did say in part 1, and this is for listeners who are coming in part 2 for whatever reason. Maybe your friend's listening to it in the car and he or she has listened to part 1, and you don't want to be that person who says, can we listen to part 1? So I will call this out that Kevin and I will be very critical at times with musical pieces. These pieces, many of them are totally fine to listen to in and of themselves. And in fact, they are worlds better than most of the modern music that people listen to today. However, I want the listeners to understand that we are going critical here. We are conducting this critical analysis with a perspective of hindsight. And we want to help listeners understand how we got to where we are today, but also how to identify certain elements of music. Like I said earlier, what's sad, but which is kind of obvious, but kind of what's going to have this effect on me. What is good, what is not so good, and what is even bad. It's what it could be summed up as. I think that's enough. I think, Kevin, I think we can get into the show, I would say.
Perfect. Let's go with part 2 of the Devolution of Music Through the Ages.
Episode 17.
And we're doing a show about the devolution of music through the ages. We started in the 9th century and spoke a little bit about Gregorian chant and a little bit about other music from the time. And we moved on to the next era, the Renaissance era, which focused on my favorite, like Palestrina, a little other issues when you start to have English coming into the choral music in the times of King Henry VIII. And we moved on to the Baroque era, which of course was filled with beautiful classical music, as I'd call it, which was Vivaldi and Bach and other good artists of the time. And we discussed how the music has devolved in terms of it once being directly sung and created for God, and now how through the ages it has digressed into being more for man. Now, up to this point in part 1, up until the classical era, which we're going to talk about in this show, it was still pretty okay. It was not too emotional. It's not immoral. It was just kind of falling away from the godliness that we saw in the earlier era. So, Matthew, thank you very much again for joining me for part 2.
Thanks, Kevin. Glad to be here. Excited to talk a bit about this one also.
And yeah, so we're going to start again in the classical era. Do you have any comments about the last show, about the other eras we spoke about?
No, not really. I think the last show is probably a bit longer than your usual shows. We went off on a few tangents, but had some really interesting discussion, I thought. I think we can get stuck into this one.
Let's do it. All right, classical era, 18th to 19th century. Let's go.
Terrific. So, the composers Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert are a part of this era. Now, we start to see harmonies getting quite interesting here. And again, the trend is continuing. Music is getting more secularized than before. One thing I personally start to notice in the classical era is that passions are starting to really show in music. Even before, we talked about the Baroque music, and you're starting to hear a bit of emotion. And I still think it's like more intellectually focused, but we start to hear some passions coming out here, more towards, I'd probably say, towards the end of the classical era. But, if someone's happy to contact me and say, actually, you're wrong, I haven't listened to every piece out there. This is kind of just what I've kind of inferred by what I have seen, but that's what I think I'm starting to see. So...
Yeah, and I mean, look, yeah. And if I can just cut in, yeah, I mean, look, I think it's really interesting, like you say. I think Mozart is kind of more the very end of the Baroque era, kind of going into the classical era. So you have much more of that beauty and a little bit of emotion, but not really the strong, the da 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 da, the Beethoven, which is much more aggressive. And then I think, as you say, the farther you get along, when you get into the early 1800s, like the time of Napoleon, you get almost into this time where I feel like you should be having like cannons shot off in the background. It's like this parade music. It's just boom, 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 boom. And I think it's more aggressive. You see a very interesting style, which of course we'll talk about, and we'll show we'll give some examples of these clips as we did in part 1, and kind of show exactly what we're talking about in this devolution of music, going from being towards God and then being a little bit more towards man, and eventually being even eventually towards the devil. So we'll get there eventually, but let's talk a little bit more about the classical era.
Yeah, and it's a great thing you mentioned as well about the Beethoven music. I think I can hear Beethoven's anger, or at least his passion, coming out, and those piano chords being bashed out. Well, I guess we'll get first into the effects that I think most of this music has on people, effects that could have emotionally, mentally, etc. The classical era does start to evolve towards the end, but just general stuff here. Again, based on my observations and acknowledging here that there are many different pieces of music. So I would say one effect here is in the classical era is we still hear some peacefulness, but I would say a bit less in the Baroque era. It's coming down. I'd say,
and
yeah.
Especially as you say, as you go on in the era. So Mozart's a little like, I know Paul, though, if he listens to this, he's going to be like, if we say anything bad against Mozart, then he may just come and hunt me down. but
I'm a Mozart fanboy too, Kevin. Don't.
Exactly. Right. So sorry, I just had to mention that. So Paul, if you're listening.
No, absolutely. So a bit less in the Baroque era with the peacefulness, stability as well, but a bit less in the Baroque era again. Again, I'm hearing intellectually stimulating things going on, keeping the listener engaged. Affects emotions slightly, but not as much, I'd say, as more modern styles. And it's arguably a bit more emotion evoking than music from the Baroque era. So we're kind of seeing a bit of a trend how it's just sort of sliding down further away from God, more towards humanism, but not only towards people, pleasing people, but also now we're starting to get into emotions. We're starting to write music for emotions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as we see, again, society changing and devolving, you see the same with music. And you see a lot of, what's the word? Lavishness, is that a word? Or things are getting decadent. Decadence. Yeah. It's very decadent. You see a lot of people wasting time, and you look into the kings and queens of these eras, and there was a lot of pettiness and a lot of wasted money and wasted time, and in a very odd part of history when you start getting into, say, the French Revolution and the American Revolution, where you started to see really the takeover of anarchy and the devil, and I mean humanism really in its highest form. And I think you do see that in the music, as we said at the beginning of the 19th century. I think you start to see this strangely decadent music, if that's the right word, in this very paradal type of form of music, which I think is fitting to the time of Napoleon, I suppose, but to me, unpleasant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point to mention. And I'd also say that even when I said how some of this music affects emotions slightly, but not much, I would argue that some of the music that gets towards the end of this era, such as some of that Beethoven stuff, can start to affect emotions. And of course, it really depends on how much is in one's musical diet. How much are people listening to a particular style of music? Not modern music, I hope, but we'll get into that. And we'll actually have an example. One of the last example for this era will be a Beethoven excerpt from, I think we can hear a bit of passion going on there, but we'll get onto that soon.
Yeah, do we want to jump into these samples already? Who do we have first here?
Let's get into it. Well, we have Mozart, who you mentioned earlier, so looks like Paolo and I will be happy with this one. Yes, we'll get into this piece.
Yeah, I think to me, Mozart really reminds me again a bit of Vivaldi. I think you have a lot of in that song. Of course, Mozart has just a ton of different music, but in that one, I really hear a lot of Vivaldi in a very similar style. And to me, it is like that Vivaldi piece we listened to in part one. It makes me a bit more emotional again than the ones in the previous eras. It makes me kind of rock back and forth. It gets me kind of excited. It's a very nice piece. It's a very, I'd say, uplifting, but it's very energetic, I suppose.
Yeah, I would agree.
Enjoy that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that's arguably Mozart's most famous piece of music, and for good reason. I think it's a really great piece of music. You can hear a bit of that Vivaldi sort of style as well. I personally find Mozart's music in general a bit more interesting than Vivaldi. again, though, there's so many pieces out there, but Mozart, and I mean, this show isn't about this, it's a bit off topic. Mozart did some crazy things that just sounded so good, though, and sometimes they're kind of silly and they're fun, but from a nerdy musical perspective, they're not just, it's not like a standard basic technique, if you will. He did some pretty cool things, so, and it works really well, but that's a bit off topic, that's getting a bit nerdy.
Well, I mean, Mozart's obviously an extremely interesting character in himself. I think wasn't he writing music by the age of 6 or 7 or something of the sort? I mean, really a true prodigy.
That's what I've heard also. I've heard that he was a prodigy. And I think it was him who listened to a piece of music in the church. Am I stealing your story? I think you might have actually meant to say this one. I'm stealing your story.
No, it's a great story. I'm glad you bring it up because it's another one of the most beautiful pieces ever written, in my opinion. And it's called Miserere Mei Deus by Allegro. It was actually written, I believe, in the 1200s maybe. So actually way back when, it's much more of a choral church piece. And actually, back when it was first written, it was much simpler than the version we hear today. So they've added on to it and made it more of this flow and more of this, what's the word, extreme. So it's got these extreme high notes, like this high C, which is very nearly a shriek almost in a way, but it's still beautiful. It's very, very high. So you have very high peaks of this, but back in the day, it wasn't quite so extreme. But anyway, it was regarded as being so beautiful that the Pope at the time said that it could not be sung outside of the Sistine Chapel in only one time a year. So I maybe 1200s is too early. Maybe it was 1400s. I'm not sure when it was. But anyway, the Pope said it could only be sung once a year in the Sistine Chapel under pain of excommunication. So it was a very serious thing. The Pope was like, this music is too beautiful, too godly to be ever sung outside of the Sistine Chapel on one day. And so eventually, years later, a couple hundred years later, a young 13-year-old boy went and listened to this song in the Sistine Chapel and promptly went home and transcribed the entire thing, wrote it all down onto a piece of music. And I guess, I don't know if maybe he performed it or maybe he gave it to somebody else. Anyway, the word got back to the Pope. The Pope brought the young boy, who was, of course, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and met with him and said, hey, actually, I won't excommunicate you. It's actually pretty impressive what you just did. So pretty interesting story that he was able to listen to the song, which is, I believe, 15 minutes long or so. It's an entire prayer. It's very long. And he was able to transcribe the entire thing, including, as far as I know, I guess the verses would have been from a well-known psalm. So he could have just put those to the music, but he put it all together after only hearing it one time. So there's a little bit of the brilliance of Mozart.
Amazing. And they didn't have computer technology as well, where you could plug in a note and hear how it sounds. So, I mean, I don't know if they used a piano, but knowing Mozart, surely he would have just had such a good knowledge of music. His dad was also, I think it was Leopold Mozart, was a violinist teacher, a music teacher as well. But what Mozart did was, I think, skillful and worked towards it, but just a lot of natural talent there, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is he probably the most well-known or well-regarded of all classical composers, I would imagine.
It's a really good question. It's a hard one to answer. I guess I'm not in that world as much, but surely he would have to be up there. I think Bach might be as well. It's renowned for some really brilliant music. And actually, if you when you start getting into classical music a lot, I when I first started really getting into it, I loved Mozart, and I still do. But I find as the taste matures a little bit, and of course this is different for everyone else, but I find myself enjoying a lot of Bach music a bit more. Even though he doesn't do some things that are like, well, that's impressive, and that's, it's very innovative, he still does things that are very impressive, but it's like a bit more of a subtle way sometimes. So Bach might be up there as well, but I couldn't say for sure.
And I think Bach, I don't know if this is what the real story is, but I think he wrote a piece of music for every day of the year and for like different, he wrote absolutely phenomenal amounts of music. So I think you could listen to Bach probably every day and hear something new for years, I think, because he was so prolific in his writing of music, which I think is pretty interesting. I mean, can you imagine And I think he would write some of these pieces like in a day. Maybe I'm remembering this incorrectly, but I think that's what I've heard. He could write an entire piece of music in a day. I just can't even fathom that. I mean, it's like I try to write, a one-page article in my own language. But I guess for him, music was kind of his language. I guess when you're that much of a genius, I suppose you don't even probably think about it.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I've always wondered the same thing. Like I said earlier about no computer technology for it. That just like I write some music in my own time, and nothing as good as what these composers have made. But if I was just using pen and paper, wow, it's hard to fathom that in this modern day.
Totally. Yeah, it's definitely genius. Okay, going on from Mozart, who I think was in the more of the beginning of the 18th century. Who do we have next for our clip of music?
We have Handel. Let's get into that one. So when I hear that, I'm hearing it's more fast-paced. You can definitely hear it's trying to, this is a given now where it's trying to please humans now. I don't think this music is trying to be written to give glory to God. That being said, there's nothing wrong with listening to it. In fact, it's actually it's very good music to listen to. When I hear that, I can hear how it's really engaging, and I like how at the end it has a really good resolution. Did you hear that as well?
Yeah, it comes together very, very nicely. And to me, and it's probably because I've watched too many movies or something about the time, but that music just makes me think of decadence. There's something, I think it's the harpsichord. There's something in that music that just makes me think of women with crazy hair and these big ball gowns walking into a king's palace or something like that. And it's probably just because that's where I've culturally heard that music. But to me, again, just personally, I can't separate it from that time period. I can't separate it from the image of golden halls and big dances and all these things that were really becoming really, really deeply worldly. And in this time, it was really, really worldly and really, really truly going away from God as a society. And again, boy, the farther you get into the French Revolution and in that era, you see the actual visible, I guess, markings of going away from God. And I'm not saying the music is like that, but that's what it conjures in my mind.
Absolutely. And I have heard, even with the Baroque era, is where there was decadence, or I guess, people living pretty extravagant lives. And that also sort of led to having really high quality extravagant music. So I would say the musical quality is there. It can be sort of hard to separate those two, of course, those two images. But what we will notice is I think it's going to start to explode a little bit when we get to that emotions as well, for emotions of people, music being written to that. Especially in the Romantic era, and even in the next excerpt that we're going to play, which is from Beethoven, as promised earlier. We're going to hear this piece, or this excerpt, is having a fair bit of passion. And it's probably one of the extreme examples. I think he would have more angry/passionate music out there. But I thought I'd give the listeners a bit of a taste of the kind of music that Beethoven wrote to get us into the Romantic era. So we're still in the classical era here, but leading towards the Romantic era.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you brought up the change of speed in the last one, because this one just amps it up about by 10, right? I mean, you can kind of imagine these fingers flying over the keyboard, which again, an amazing amount of skill. and definitely an entertaining piece, but you hear this sense of almost chaos, right? Almost it's not chaos, but it's frenetic. It's kind of like this in a rush to go somewhere, and it definitely for me does not make me feel peaceful.
Not at all. And I don't know so much about the history of every composer. I have heard that Beethoven was not of the highest moral character. I think he might have been a drunkard and actually a French revolutionary, but that's what I've heard, so I'm not certain. But when you listen to that music, like, don't get me wrong, like, if I hear that, I think, hey, that actually sounds pretty cool, but that's definitely not something I would say speaks to my intellect. There's definitely, it's like you can hear, like, towards the end, like you can sort of imagine someone just swishing his head left and right, you know, almost like you would imagine the modern guitarist, you know, sort of like that as they're playing the piano. You can hear that passion coming. It's definitely starting to cater towards the passion of man.
Right, which is it's still okay, and it's not like we're condemning it. And we forgot to mention at the beginning of the show, we're not moral authorities. We're not going to condemn anything. We're just two guys talking about music. So keep that in mind. If you have any issues with what we're saying, or if you have any questions about the topic, what is good, what is moral, what is immoral about music, please speak to your priest. If you have any questions about what we've researched, or if you want to, mention something we've said wrong, then please, you can email either me or Matthew. I'll put both email addresses in the show notes of this show. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, you really start to feel kind of like this, oh boy, where are we going? What's next? And I think that leads us very, very nicely into the next era, which is the Romantic era, the 19th to 20th century. So tell me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So here we go. We're coming closer to now. So Beethoven and Schubert were also a part of this era, overlapping with the classical period. We have some Romantic era exclusive, I believe these are exclusive composers, Mendelssohn, Tchaikovsky, and Chopin. Just calling it out there, I am not a fan of this music. I actually you would never really catch me listening to it at all. I can't even think of one piece that I would actually put on my favorite playlist because it's becoming too emotional for me. Doesn't mean that the music is bad to listen to, and maybe there are some pieces I would like, but this is where the clear divide comes for me personally, and I think we'll start to hear that. Music is getting more emotional, focusing less on distinct and intellectually focused melodies, I would say, but creating sounds through harmony to evoke emotions. I would also say that music is starting to sound more like theatrical music. The theatrical music that we are familiar with in our era. I know a lot of people who listen to movie theme music, and look, there's nothing wrong with that. It's worlds better listening to classical. Well, I say classical. It's more like theatrical movie film music than it is to listening to pop, etc. But there's such a difference in the quality compared to even like the classical era, and the Baroque era, for instance. We start to hear composers stretching the rules of harmony, trying to push things further. They're still respecting the overall rules and guidelines of music composition, based on my understanding. And before we get on to the effects that I think, Kevin, was there anything you wanted to add?
I think I would just comment again, as you say, I don't like this era much either. I don't think I find myself really ever listening to it. I think the one that comes to my mind is Wagner, who was a German musician back in, the mid 1800s. And he wrote some very famous pieces, like The Night on Bald Mountain. And it's actually, I think, I've heard different rumors. Some people say that he was a Satanist. Others say that it was written about Norse mythology. Norse mythology. Norse mythology. I'm going to get it right one of these times. But anyway, either way, it's very dark. And in an interesting sub-story to that, we went to the castle Neuschwanstein, which is in Bavaria here, a couple hours from where we live. A very famous German castle. I'm sure everyone's seen it. It's the fairy tale princess castle here in Germany. Beautiful place. And I really love visiting there. But when you go inside, it was built by, oh boy, I didn't do any research before this. I think it was Ludwig II or Wilhelm II. I always forget. My friends will definitely complain about me not knowing. Anyway, one of these German kings Bavarian kings, who was very well known for being a bit of a, I don't even know the word, a little mentally unstable. But anyway, in this castle, he had these different rooms which were based off of some of Wagner's music. And I remember going through these rooms, and one of them was this dark cave, like this black cave in the castle. It's this black cave, literally just a cave in a castle. It's really bizarre. And it just felt to me verging on evil. And I get the same sense, especially with Wagner. You get the sense of that it's not even just going towards humanistic. In my opinion, purely speculative opinion, I start to think it starts to sound even satanic, especially with Wagner. I think you hear these sounds that are very dissonant and mean almost, and dark, and they evoke dark passions, I think. And it's another interesting off topic. Sorry, I'm going to stop in about 30 seconds. But Disney, Walt Disney, if you watch the movie Fantasia, and I think a lot of the music from there, maybe all of it comes from Wagner. And it's this very dark music, which was meant for kids. And you see, again, this is back in the 1950s and or 60s maybe. And you see Disney kind of going off in this really strangely dark direction, which I'm sure you know very well that Disney is a very dark company. And anyway, that's my little bit of a ramble about the era that I think, especially with some of these artists, you start to see really, really going downhill quickly.
Yeah, interesting point. I'll even say that the excerpts I have chosen aren't as bad as. How do you pronounce? Sorry, Wagner.
Wagner. So Wagner, you'd say in English. Yeah.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Richard Wagner or Wagner, they say in.
Yeah.
In
okay. Oh, okay. Cool. I think I've been pronouncing the German way.
That's the one of his famous ones. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm not a massive fan at all of that kind of music, and you even hear that from memory a lot of Russian music as well. To me it sounds, and this is going a bit off topic. The excerpts will show different kind of emotions being evoked, but that music to me just sounds, I would almost say, just noisy. It's like, let's chuck a heap of instruments and make this sound go crash, 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 and then let's make this other sound go crash, crash, crash. And look, I actually don't listen to it that much, so someone who does like that kind of music or listens to it might be thinking, you're an idiot, Matt. You have no idea what you're talking about. But that's always the impression I get whenever I think of Wagner/Wagner.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so what's our next piece we're going to listen to?
Gotcha. Well, I guess, did you want me to quickly just talk about the effects? Or
yeah, of course. Might
as well be quickly. Yeah. So, and I have to say that, as always, when I'm talking about the effects that from the music from an era might have on people, mentally, emotionally, etc., it's really just based on my own observations, being a music nerd. And we have to acknowledge as well, there's just so many different pieces of music out there. So I'm really trying to generalize just to give everyone a big picture, high level breakdown, just to get your mind thinking about things. So with the Romantic era, I would say that music is less intellectually stimulating. So what I'm starting to hear, if I'm fully honest with you, is we noticed how from the medieval era to the classical era, yes, it's getting more human, but it's getting more intellectually stimulating. I think with the Romantic era that we're actually getting less intellectually stimulating. So we're getting more humanistic, but we're digressing even from the brain. Starting to talk a bit more to the heart, and I don't mean that in a good way, because I say that this music affects emotions and feelings. Thus, we see that this music, in my opinion, and we'll listen to excerpts and you can have your opinion as well, is catering to people's emotions and/or swaying them. And we get to hear a lot less stability and a lot less peacefulness. We'll get into this a bit later, but one thing to call out is that the Catholic teaching, or my understanding is that the Catholic teaching is that we act with our intellect. We love God with our intellect. It's not about emotions. It's not about feelings, contrary to what a lot of people think these days. Was there a Disney cartoon that had "Listen to Your Heart" or "Let Your Conscience Be Your Guide"? Was that a Disney cartoon? It sounds like something.
Like every single one, pretty much.
Every single one. Okay, cool. I remember one as a kid. When we obviously we don't watch Disney now. Our kids, we don't even have a TV in the house. Like, it's just modern.
Smart.
Terrible. But so that's a real message that even I think Catholics due to the French Revolution and due to all the modern stuff, the society we live in, we tend to think, even implicitly, that it's about how you feel. Like if I feel inspired about something, then I'm on the right track. Where the Catholic Church teaches, my understanding is, your emotions and feelings actually need to be put in check. They're there for a reason, but you've got to keep those in check, and your mind has to be the thing in control. And we see this music getting away from catering to people's minds and starting to cater to people's feelings. And I think that's quite dangerous when we see where this is going.
Totally. And as we said before, I mean, the music goes as the society goes. You can really see it start to go away from God, become more, human, and then more emotional, and then really extremely emotional after the French Revolution and into the Industrial Revolution, where really the entire society, as it had been built for hundreds of years, started to collapse. Now, our modern day historians and teachers will tell us, at the public schools will tell us, hey, this was a good thing. The Industrial Revolution is the best thing that ever happened. The French Revolution is the second best thing that ever happened. It was modernizing, it's progressivism. But if you actually look into it, you see the absolute loss of tradition and culture in the modern family, or I should say the traditional family, and how family is supposed to be together, and how society is supposed to be built. And as this was happening at the exact same time, music was also, leading into that. And as you said, I think in the last show, the music is made by people who live in the society. So it reflects the mentality and the spirituality of the society. And it's really starting to be sad. I think you start to really get, it gets almost depressing when you start to hear the music and how society was changing from being godly to ungodly.
Oh, spot on. Absolutely. And I think we can get into an example of that now. So let's get into playing a Schubert excerpt. So when I hear that, there is a clear difference in the emotional aspect. It's so sad, but it's just, for me personally, I find it emotional and sad, but not in a beautiful way. Some people might beg to differ, but when I start to hear that, I actually start to feel like the previous music. I know you said, Kevin, how Cavalli was making you feel a bit upbeat and stuff, but would you agree that the emotional effect of that kind of music is actually so minuscule compared to what we just listened to?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as you say, I mean, the other music was at least a little bit uplifting and it makes you move a little bit, but in a good way. It's a positive emotion and not a very big one, as you say, but right. This one makes you kind of, imagine Bambi dying or Bambi's mother being shot in the woods or something, right? I mean, it is this tear invoking sound, which, yeah, I mean, you think, okay, sadness has its place in society. And of course it does. I mean, there is true sadness and there's good sadness and there are good tears, but do we really want music to make us feel sad?
Exactly right. And I would say, like you said, there is a place for it, arguably. Like, you could have a movie, for instance, that is totally licit and fine, probably not made by Hollywood, let's be honest, but let's just say you got this indie movie out, maybe one made by Catholics like St. Genesius Films. That's that's the Crusade of Acanthus, traditional Catholics making homemade movies, really good stuff. And having music to put forward an emotion to go with the scene for something that is legitimate, I think is fine. Obviously, how you consume that has to be done in moderation. And you could even say the same thing, like if you like this kind of music, you could definitely listen to it. It's still a lot better than like modern pop, etc. But I just don't think you'd want this kind of music as like the main music in your diet.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you listen to this all the time, you're going to be walking around the house with your head down and maybe crying into your Cheerios, as we'd say. And that's obviously not something we want. I mean, again, there are some emotions are meant to be used in the right way, and that they are good in some ways, but you have to control them. And if you're listening to music that makes you sad, how is that going to help you control them? I mean, it is manipulating your emotions into a negative, way. And I think that's not something we should want. And again, as I mentioned before, it's not only sad emotions. It's also like with Wagner, it's also angry emotions. And I think that we see that again more and more as we go, these either sad or angry, and kind of goes a little bit away from joy, maybe.
I think so, because there's really not much peace in this music. Where I would say that there was still some peacefulness and stability in that classical era and the Baroque era. You can still feel it. It's not spiritual. It's not like this music is making you think of God. But on a natural level, I would say that it's pretty good. This stuff I'm listening to now it's like a decline in, like, it's not even naturally good.
Yeah, I agreed.
Yeah. So we'll get into the next example, which is Tchaikovsky.
Yeah, that one actually, it's kind of funny. I enjoy that one definitely more than the other ones of this era. And I think that has some nice melody and some nice, even peacefulness to it. I think I still think for this one, I still think of decadence. I think of waltzing and dancing. And again, it's not bad in itself. I mean, I could tell you my wife would love to go to a Viennese waltz at some point, which I think is fine. But there is still something to it that is definitely worldly, but for me, I actually didn't catch too many negative emotions in that one. What do you think about that one?
No, I agree. There's no negative emotions there. What I am starting to hear, though, is music is starting to, for me, the melodies were less distinct, and we're starting to now create a sound of like, yes, there's a main melody there, but I'm hearing that there's so much harmony back in it that it's creating an overall feeling, and that overall feeling is being predominant compared to all these different melodies going on, and it gets a bit flowery. That it's starting to get a bit fluffy as well, in my opinion. But yeah, definitely a lot different compared to the previous excerpt for a Romantic era piece.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's interesting to see again how it evolved or devolved into where it is now, and into the next case, which I think again we get farther and farther down the rungs of beauty, and then we move right into the 20th century in the modernist postmodern era. Unless you have something else to say about the Romantic era.
Well, we did have actually one more excerpt, and I wanted to play this one if that's okay, because it's actually a really famous piece that people in modern times will love, but based on what we're saying and what you've listened to so far, I would think that the listeners might have a different approach on this one. It's Clair de Lune by Debussy. I guess we'll get into it now.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I think I find it to be how do I describe this? The end. Dreamy? I think the end is exactly. It's very dreamy. The end is satisfying and comes to a decent conclusion. But I think especially in the middle, you really start to hear that dissonance and those. Again, I'm no musical expert, but to me, I hear it doesn't sound. A lot of these notes don't sound like they fit to me. I don't know if that's what you hear, but to me, it doesn't. It's nice, but there's a lot of stuff that is not together or something. I don't know.
I think it's really starting to stretch the rules of music. This one potentially, actually, I think might have gone a bit still keeping within some rules, but challenging it a fair bit. And of course, the modern person would say, "Good on you!" Like that's what genius is made of. It's not really the case. With this one, I find it dreamy. I find those notes playing again. It's creating a feeling rather than a distinct melody to me. Obviously, you've got the da 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 da, but it's all those other notes that are going there. For me, it seems to be focused on creating an overall feeling, and it's dreamy. And I'm listening to it, and you're sort of like, where is this going? You know, like, and it starts to almost feel like it doesn't have much of a purpose. And if it does have a purpose, the purpose is maybe a bit shallow or dumb or not good, potentially. I don't want to read too much into it, but I don't really care for that piece at all.
And as you say, that's fairly controversial because I think many people would find it very beautiful. And I think, again, I mean, as a piece of its own, it's fine. But you start to see, it go down and down and down. You start to break rules, and you start to really hear the dissonance of issues starting to happen. And I guess before we move into the next, I actually did want to comment on a few of these more modern choral pieces because we don't have excerpts from these. That's fine. But I'm sure people have probably heard of a few of them, I would assume. One of them is Ave Maria by Franz Biebel. And it's one I actually really enjoy. I actually like it very much. It's a very nice piece. You can sing it with 7 parts, usually with men or women or a different mixed. And actually, when I was in Omaha, we sung it with the Mater Dei men's choir. And one of the best achievements of my singing career was that, because it's a very tough piece and very beautiful piece. But you really start to hear the change. You start to hear the dissonance, and you start to hear notes that don't quite work. And I like this song, but it doesn't quite fit. It pulls it off because it has enough beauty to it, but you start to really hear the dissonance in notes not always working with other notes. The other song, which I actually really enjoy, is Agnus Dei by Barber. I don't know his first name. Philip, maybe Barber. And that was written, I think, in the 1920s. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But it's another one where it's really, you hear a lot of dissonance. You hear a lot of chords that don't mix. They don't go well together, but they still keep it beautiful. But anyway, these are songs that were written for the church. They're sacred songs that were written during the time of, I don't know, Pius X and Pius XI, times of true popes. But you still already hear something really changing, even in sacred music. And the farther you go along in the 20th century, which again we'll talk about here coming up, you really start to hear, even in church music, that the change from being major chords or even minor chords into just purely dissonant, almost chaos.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I actually hadn't listened, and I still haven't listened to a lot of that music. I did listen to a piece that you recommended. I've forgotten what it's called, but it was quite nice to listen to. But you could hear that dissonance, those notes that sort of don't fit automatically to the human ear. So I guess you could say without resistance to the human ear, as maybe in the classical or Baroque era, where usually you hear something and it just sounds really, like, most of the time, really satisfying throughout the whole way. There are going to be some pieces that, they want to really do a strong resolution. And to do a really strong resolution, you've got to build a lot of tension and you've got to go a bit away from the home chord, so to speak. But as a general rule, I could hear that difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess that's a good segue into the next century. Hopefully I haven't skipped over something again. But if you want to, let's go ahead and go into the 20th century.
So we get into the 20th century, which is also known as the modernist era and postmodern era. Now, when we see, when it's referred to as modernist, it's not talking about it as the heretical term. I mean, is it a heresy? I don't know if you would consider it a philosophy heresy. I'm not sure. I'm not all across that. But we do know as traditional Catholics that the word modernism refers to a set of beliefs, something that's really evil, really bad. However, this is just a label of the era of music. Maybe I should take the word just out of there. The fact that it has that word modernist in there is maybe something to think about, something for listeners to think about when they're listening to this show as a whole. So we'll move on, and I'm going to be talking more about the actual classical music, or what people would call modern classical. This era is for the 20th century to now. Just an FYI as well to listeners, and we'll get into this a bit more. But if you're the kind of person who is listening to modern music and you're deciding you want to make that change and you want to go classical, you might be tempted to type in modern classical, right? Because you're thinking, I'm just being honest with myself. I have an ear that's attuned to more modern music. I want to change it, but I want to go about it in a way that I think is going to keep me motivated. Typing in modern classical into Google is going to give you the exact opposite. The music from like the Baroque era, the classical era, is actually, funnily enough, more similar to probably a lot of the pop songs that sound good than this stuff, because this is getting really ugly. So we'll get into it. So we have music getting more theatrical and less melodic, concentrating on evoking emotions and focusing minimally on the intellectual aspects of music. Now, the modern classical music that I refer to as being super ugly is a new genre of music that was born in the early-ish, I guess, 20th century, and this genre is serialism. Now, this style of composition is a rejection of the previous rules and guidelines of composition. And what it aims to do, I believe, is to remove the concept of a home chord and trying to make all chords/notes equal. I haven't just heard Catholics say this. I've heard secular people in the music scene say this, and I've also heard secular people in the music scene express a view that it ties into the rise of things like communism and socialism, right? Equality. So what's fascinating to me about this, and I probably shouldn't talk about it too much because serialism's kind of gone by the wayside. It hasn't really, it kind of died out a little bit because it actually sounds so bad. But it's just crazy how we see that the ideologies of those terrible political systems, those beliefs coming into music. And what happened is, well, my understanding is what happened is you had a movement that was still trying to do the things that people were trying to do, composers were trying to do in the Romantic era. Stay within the rules, push them as far as I can, maybe break the odd one here and there, I guess. I don't know. I'm actually not, I don't analyze music that often, but that's what I'm kind of hearing. But then you had this other movement and they got into all these other things. I'm not going to nerd out too much, but they basically tried to reject it. And basically what ended up happening, I'm told, is that there were no rules. Now that's frightening. Composers are then thinking, what? No rules? What on earth do I do? I can do anything I want. That's what do I do? So you had some composers, I mean, if you want to call them composers, you had some people trying to write music that were in this, trying to now find order in the chaos, which is very much like an implementation of communism or socialism to me. And what I find fascinating is we have the name Arnold Schoenberg, and he codified the rules of this serialism music. I think there were others who tried to do it, but their rules weren't really accepted. I think this was kind of like, yep, this guy's got the rules down. This is the guy. I would argue it was a more dictatorial system of music than ever before. So, and it's ugly. So we have, let's get away from traditional music and all their rules. Oh, there's no rules. Let's make something that's more strict than what we had before and ugly. I'm going to let you comment, Kevin. I know that you loved seeing that correlation between music and society or political systems, etc. So I'll let you go for gold on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see very clearly when men think they can do whatever they want, it almost always ends up in ugliness. When they try to go away from God's beauty, God gives us beauty in trees and mountains and people and I mean we see it in this music that was created for God. You see it in art that reflects God's beauty, which is God's beauty in nature, God's beauty in people. Things that are made by God are beautiful because they were made by God, who is beautiful. But when people say that doesn't matter anymore and we're not going to listen to these rules as made by God, beauty as given to us by God is not actually beauty, then of course it's chaos. And it's how it works in society. It works in government. It works in art. I mean, look at modern art like Pablo Picasso. They said, oh, beauty doesn't exist. Beauty is whatever I want it to be, which of course is absolutely insane. Beauty is what God made it as, not what I think it to be. Now, obviously, there are some things that are subjectively beautiful. That's true. Some people can find something more beautiful, but some things are absolutely objectively beautiful. A picture by Da Vinci is objectively more beautiful than a some paint thrown onto a wall by some modern artist. That is absolutely fact. You cannot deny it. You can try to. You can say, hey, this paint that drips down this white wall is interesting. It's cool. It's not beautiful. And it's a joke to pretend that it is. And it sounds like this other form of music, like you say, is someone trying to throw paint on the wall. And as it drips down, they just assume that, I guess that was before this reconstruction, I guess. So that was the chaos. And then someone said, okay, no, instead of this chaos, I'm going to make my own rules rather than God's rules of beauty. And of course, if you try to make your own rules of beauty, it's just going to turn into ugliness.
Absolutely. And even this music that's been, codified with all these rules is described as expressionism or abstract, which is kind of the art you were referring to. It has no beauty to it. And I think Schoenberg, from memory, actually did do some paintings, and my goodness, are they disgusting. You can just look it up if you really want to. One thing to note as well is that this serialism, expressionism, or ugly music, if you just want to be basic, came about during the time around the World Wars, I believe. And we have to understand that many people were subject to traumatic events in those times, whether they were in the war, maybe they were even not in the war, but fighting in the war, I should say, or if they were just in a country that wasn't involved in wars. And it actually has been argued by others, and again, I'm not talking about Catholics here, that these world wars have affected the forms of art. For instance, if someone's been subject to horrific and ugly things in war, then their art and music may express this, especially, and this is probably the key bit that the secular commentators will not pick up on, especially if there's a rejection of God. And I think that's key here. And so all these things coming into play.
Yeah, and add on to that of course before in the 19th century or whenever, there was no form of music publication other than concerts or something. So it was actually touching very few people at a time, right? So you'd have 100 people at a concert, maybe 1,000 people at a concert, whatever. And then when you get into the 20th century, you of course have mass production of media. You have broadcasts. You have these things that is going out into it's more quantity rather than quality. And boy, oh boy, do we see that now. I mean, and it's progressively, again, the society says that the Industrial Revolution is the greatest thing to ever happen to mankind. And it's absolutely not true. It is forced quantity into everything. And it is absolutely stamped under its feet quality in almost anything. And especially in America, I see it, maybe in Australia as well. Germany's a little bit better, but quality almost doesn't matter anymore. It's just a matter of how much and how fast. And that is also, I think, something that absolutely you see again in the devolution of music as well as society, that it crumbles together.
Oh, absolutely. And we're going to get just into one excerpt of this music just to give listeners a feel. We're talking about this ugliness. Let's have a listen. I'm not going to do any more because I couldn't stomach any more. So we'll get into an excerpt from Arnold Schoenberg. Oh my goodness! When I listen to that, I just think, can you please resolve? It's a nerdy musical term, but it's actually probably not that nerdy. But in classical music, you have resolutions, and it's actually satisfying. And I would say it might even have an emotional or mental effect to have that satisfying. It's called a resolution. It's like saying there's something that needs to be resolved, and then it is resolved. And when something's resolved, that's really good. This music, if it resolves, it's probably going to be very unlikely and possibly an accident. when you hear that, well, I mean, it sounds terrible the whole way through, but you're kind of thinking, what are you doing? Can you just end on something?
It totally reminds me of these 1920s silent films, but it's kind of like it made me picture Sherlock Holmes for some reason. But Sherlock Holmes only searching, right? Like you said, that's really what I thought of before you said that. It made me think of him always searching and never finding the clues, right? It's always this anticipation of like you say, there's no conclusion. It's like, okay, Sherlock Holmes is searching and he's searching and he's searching and he's searching and there's no answer. And I think that, and again, as you see in so much media these days, that's just what ugliness is. That's where we've come. And I think that, I guess, actually in our modern music, like you said, the actual pop and stuff, which we're going to talk about in the next episode, is actually more pleasing than that. They're much smarter. They've realized that, okay, we're not going to capture anyone with ugly music. We actually have to make it catchy. We have to make it so people are going to be emotionally captivated and involved. And so it's a much different story. But you see though that when you, again, don't try to mock God. Don't try to create something that is against beauty. And when you do, you see it just turns into this filth.
Yeah, absolutely right. And one thing I would like to point out as well is whenever there's a greater evil than an evil that someone else might fall into, or you might be tempted to fall into, you start to think that the lesser evil is okay. It's kind of like an example of, let's just say someone's committing mortal sins left, right, and center, but they're mortal sins that are socially acceptable. And then you could say to yourself, but at least I'm not doing drugs. And I think sometimes people might think, I'm listening to pop music, but at least I'm not listening to serialism. And I think that's something that's very dangerous to fall into. So yes, we've described how ugly this is, but I would urge listeners to not use that as an excuse if you're interested in the pop stuff. Like, please don't use it as an excuse. It's not going to get you very far.
Right, exactly. And I mean, two wrongs don't make anything better. I mean, don't go listen to something that's just as bad. I mean, because that music is emotionally bad, I guess, or it's just ugly, but it's not actually immoral. There's no bad words, there's no bad lyrics. So I guess, when you actually start looking into pop, it sounds a lot better, but it's usually much, much worse. I mean, that's the reality.
And yeah, absolutely. And even though this music we just listened to is disordered, pop music is disordered in different ways. And I would argue, and I think Disney, this is the same thing that makes Disney so dangerous, is putting dangerous evil, but slapping a nice wrapper on it and presenting it in such a way that there's something captivating enough so that people find it enjoyable enough to listen to, and they're happy to do a trade-off for something evil because there's something appealing about it. And that's really, really, really smart. Like, if you're trying to make an impact on society, you have to appeal to something. And I think listeners need to be very aware of how smart these evil forces are. But look, that's probably getting a little bit off topic, but just something to mention, I think.
Oh, and I would love to talk about it in part 3, because we're going to talk about the effects of modern music and how we can battle those issues and what to do with the knowledge of knowing that this modern music is so bad for us. And I mean, I would love to talk about some of the Disney songs, because that's a super great example of lyrics not being directly immoral. There's nothing implicitly implied about it. But if you actually go into it, you start reading the lyrics, you can tell that they are absolutely against our Catholic morals, and they're against our beliefs, and they're absolutely something we should never want our kids listening to or singing to, for sure. And I would love to talk about that. I've talked about that a little bit in previous shows, but I'd love to get your take on it as well, because I think it's vitally important that we are not just banning ourselves from rap music or from metal music, because that's easy as Catholics. We already know. Come on, how many people listening to this show already listen to rap or to hard rock? I think very few. More of the issue is these things that we think to be on the edge of okay. And I think that you and I really want to talk about what we believe to really not be okay, and what they're trying to, how the devil has been really good at getting evil in through the cracks, rather than back in the past when it was much more in your face. And I think that we will talk about that in the next episode. Unless do you have any more comments about part 2, or do you want to talk next part 3?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I might just do a tiny introduction to get the listeners, get a bit of information, a bit of a teaser, so to speak, for what we're going to discuss in the next show. And I'll just quickly touch on the new modern genres being born, such as jazz and rock and roll, which have led to all the other genres that we have today, such as pop, rock, metal, etc. And one thing to point out is the origins of such music is questionable, which Kevin you've touched on in an earlier podcast. And the impure lyrics, I would say, of most songs in these styles of music is an indication of this. I'm not going to talk about the origins of it, but people can look into things if they want. But one thing I do want to point out, let's get back onto analysing the music itself. The music is focused around a drum beat, that boom, cha, or I'm thinking of a boom, boom, cha, or even just a boom, boom. Having this drum beat, this loud, predominant, booming thing, has never been such a focus in Western music. Now, people might say, but you had the timpani, you've got lots of opera, you have a lot of classical music that uses drums. Very true. And drums were used for certain things, but not such a degree that it is now. I mean, the concept of you would have a ballad nowadays with drum beat that drives that ballad. If you listen to these really soft music pieces from classical, you're probably not going to have a drum in sight or an earshot, I guess is probably a more accurate thing to say. It's just a huge focus. And even if you listen to the way things are mixed, I don't even listen to modern pop music from memory. It's like, or even if something comes up on the radio when I'm out shopping, you can hear that drum beat. It's like all focused around how much can we make this kick drum stand out so much, that kick drum, that boom, boom. And anyone who is honest with themselves would acknowledge that drum beat has an effect on them. I mean, people listen to that kind of music when they're working out because they're trying to get an adrenaline going. So you can't say that music, just because it has a drum beat, doesn't have an effect somewhat. You would have to be lying to yourself to say that. And one thing I do want to point out as well is that the concept of this drum beat and a lot of these drums, they come from Africa. And I haven't got full proof of this, but I'm going to say most likely from pagan origins. And I would say again, if anyone's really honest with themselves, I would say that's probably the same conclusion you would reach. What are your thoughts, Kevin?
Yeah, I think it's almost unquestionable, and it's not the African people's fault in many cases that they were pagans. It took a long time for the missionaries and the Catholics to get to them, and a lot of them came as slaves, and they had a rough going. So I think we both would agree with that. We don't want to be YouTube canceled because of being racist or anything. That's definitely not our point. But the culture in general, as they came to the Western world, they were pagans, and they brought that music with them. I think that's absolutely unquestionable. And I think that you know it. You instinctively know that the music with the drum beats and that's getting your heart going and stuff is leading to just your emotions running hot. And if you know that is against Catholic teaching or beliefs, as we mentioned in previous shows, that your will should control your emotions, not the other way around, and that's a very, very basic belief of the Catholic faith.
Oh, spot on. And one thing I want to mention as well is I haven't actually listened to this music by St. Hildegard von Bingen, but I have heard, and she's from the medieval era, I believe. She did write some pieces, and I'm going to guess most likely sacred, that did have a beat. Again, I haven't heard them. I've just heard of this when I was talking to people to research for this show. However, one thing I would say would be obvious is that the beat would really be there simply to keep time, and I could just imagine that it's not going to be a predominant feature. So I just wanted to sort of call that out. When people are faced with a decision to give up something that they like, they generally come up with really dumb excuses, even though they don't know it's dumb themselves. They're scraping the barrel for something to justify. They're just trying to find something to justify. And I just wanted to throw that out there in case someone was thinking something along those lines. It's dumb. I don't think I need to tell anyone really, but if anyone actually thinks that, or St. Hildegard von Bingen used some rhythm, therefore modern music is okay, I just wanted to point out that that's clearly not going to fly, and I don't think any more comment is needed on that.
Yeah, right. And again, I mean, we're not condemning any sort of music. We don't have the authority to do so, but people know, come on, be honest with yourselves. And some of the stuff, if you don't, that's the kind of stuff that I think we should really point out, like the Disney stuff. That's such an important topic because it's so gray. They do a really perfect job of making it not obvious. They don't talk about sex or anything bad that's just automatically, okay, bad. But they make it so it's this stuff that they have lyrics that are directly defiant. It's rebellious. It's going against your parents. It's going against society. It's going against what your elders want you to do. And in our society now, it's like, yeah, of course, because as you said before, it's all about me. It's about what I want. It's about what's best for me as a person, not for the group. And of course, again, that is directly contrary to Catholic teaching, that nothing should be about us ever. Nothing should ever be about me. It's always about God first, of course, and then it's about family, and then it's about society, and then at the very, very, very end of all the things that should matter, it's about me. And that's always been the teachings of the Catholic faith. And anything that says otherwise is against Catholic teaching. And we have to realize that. Parents, please go read the lyrics of these Disney songs, and I promise you, your eyes will be opened to what your kids are singing. Your kids are singing along to it because they're catchy tunes and they're princess singing them. They're bad lyrics, and they should absolutely not be allowed in a Catholic home.
Spot on. And just because I like to not let people off the hook, just for listeners as well, just don't think I would say that, as long as I don't listen to Disney or my kids don't listen to Disney, I'm good. It's super important. But if you're an adult and you're listening, it's not just Disney and it's not just kids who need to be not listening to modern music. And just something I would quickly argue, and this is just based on my observations, just to wrap up the show, I would argue that melody-centric music speaks to one's intellect. Harmony-centric music speaks to one's emotions. So with the melody, we start to see the melodies. Centric music, I would say, is a lot from the medieval era, probably through till the classical era, or a part of the classical era. Harmony is where the harmony-centric music starts to show its head in the classical era and a lot in the romantic era. And then I would argue, finally, that rhythm-centric music that focuses or revolves around a beat, speaks to one's passions. And as Catholics, and we've mentioned this plenty of times in this series so far, we know that our passions need to be kept in check. So would we really want to listen to music that doesn't help us achieve that target?
All right. Yeah, I think you're totally right there, Matt. And I think that we will end part 2 of our show there. Again, went a little longer than normal, but I think for both of us, I mean, I really enjoy it. I think it's an absolutely brilliant topic. I think it's really fascinating. And I think it's a microcosm of society. I think we can see that in music. And I think that's an important way to understand what's happened since the medieval times. It's a long time. It's a lot of history. A lot of things have happened. But I think if we understand, why was it that music from the 9th and 12th century was more godly? Why is it less godly now? I think if we understand that, we can understand maybe a little bit better how we can be godly ourselves. How do we try to, give ourselves to God, and how do we become more godly? Because that, in the end, of course, is our only goal in life, is to reach heaven and to love God on earth. And we can do that, of course, by simply listening to music that is more godly than not. And I think that's the least of things that we can try to do in trying to get to heaven. And we're going to talk much more about modern music in part 3. We're going to talk about the effects that it has on us, on our children, on society. And we're going to talk about alternatives that you can listen to that might be just as entertaining, but not quite so evil. So thank you again, Matthew, for joining me for part 2. We will be back for part 3 here in a couple days, and I'm looking forward to it. Matt, until then, God bless.
Thanks, Kevin. God bless. Great to be here. That was great.
You've been listening to the Catholic Family Podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family. You can support the production on Patreon and PayPal, and you can reach Kevin at kevin89davis@gmail.com. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, all for the greater glory of God.